Maurice Newman, many thanks for your time. The Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, calls it a values-based capitalism, some sort of partnership between government and business to try and improve the outcomes of all Australians. Now, you're the man who brought Milton Friedman, the great free market economist, the Nobel Prize winner, to Australia here last. What do you imagine that Milton Friedman would have said to this?
I think he would have said, "I told you so." I think that what Mr. Chalmers, or Dr. Chalmers, is putting out there is his own sense of what values are important, not necessarily what everybody else's values think are important. And it's quite clear that the methods that he is outlining to achieve those objectives have not been successful anywhere. So he's proposing these things as if they are new, but it's really just regurgitating and repackaging socialism or even fascism that we've seen fail everywhere else.
Socialism, fascism, these are pretty strong words for something that he says. He's still suggesting that supply-side economics is something that will drive the economy. Why do you think that this move is a lurch to the left for our overall economy?
Well, it's either a lurch to the left or the right, whichever way you want to put it. But certainly what we see is that it's a centralist move. It's where government is going to have more control over business, over investment, over trade unions. So in other words, it's all coming to the centre to be presumably orchestrated by the Treasurer, Mr. Dr. Chalmers.
OK, so a part of this is about trying to raise living standards. It's about trying to also have the whole notion of climate change at the centre of what companies do. But through environmental and social governance, ESG, aren't companies already doing that themselves?
Well, companies are being forced to do that. The banks are being forced to do it by the central bank. The corporations are being overseen by ASIC. They're being judged on the question of whether they're greenwashing. So all of that is already happening, and of course it means that these companies are having the purpose for which they've been established, which is innovation, profitability, etc., diverted by these side issues. Of course, the proponents of climate change will say, well, they're not a side issue, they're absolutely existential.
So the market-based economy, Jim Chalmers says it's failed Australians. Would that be your proposition as well, that it's failed?
Well, what I would say is that the so-called market-based economy is less market-based than it was, say, when Milton Friedman was here 30 or 40 years ago. So that we've been going down this route. The Productivity Commission came out with a report quite recently that showed that per capita the GDP has gone down and is the lowest it's been in 60 years. We've seen also, when it comes to the wealth disparity, which is obviously one of the tenets of what Dr. Chalmers is proposing, he talks about greater equality. What we're seeing there is that the wealth disparity has never been greater. Now, you can blame that on free markets if you like, but free markets are certainly not operating. Governments are ensuring that the private sector is increasingly beholden to its edicts, to its legislation. So this is going to have an impact on innovation. It's going to have an impact on productivity. And of course, if you don't have growing profits, if you don't have wealth creation, then you're not going to have the wealth to redistribute through pensions or whatever else.
So what would you say about the notion that banks, the Royal Commission, they put profit ahead of their customers? But surely it's a partnership between customers, shareholders and staff.
Well, what we found with the Royal Commission is that the banks, when it came to the question of profitability, they had the protection of the central bank, which said that they were too big to fail. Also, the fact that if I was a financial institution wanted to compete with the banks, I was at a significant disadvantage. So there wasn't proper competition there in the first place. And if ever you've tried to move banks, that's not an easy thing to do. And essentially, if you've got a mortgage, then again, the limitations are there. So these are institutional rigidities that are imposed by the authorities that make competition extremely difficult. And so you're not getting the effect of a market. If it's operating at all, it's somewhat been watered down as a consequence of the need to meet these requirements through money laundering, whatever they are. I mean, what happened with the Commonwealth Bank, the NAB and the other banks that were caught so-called money laundering? I mean, the question is, why were the banks in that position in the first place? Why didn't Austrac do that? Why didn't all the transactions go through to Austrac and let them do the necessary investigation as to whether the money was being laundered? It's true that at the margin there were some cases which should have been picked up, but there were questions about the technology and all the rest of it. And I'm not running an excuse for the banks. I'm simply making the point that what we're finding now is it becoming more and more difficult for people to deal with banks. And we've seen that in the securities market, where more and more regulation has frozen out small investors because they can't, they're not sufficiently profitable for the advisors who would previously have taken them on.
Okay, so I want to take you one step back on that though, because Milton Friedman, a free marketeer, yourself a free marketeer, you would say that businesses should be able to fail. One of the issues we're seeing here in the energy markets right now, we've seen it in banks as you've described, is in many cases businesses, well, they're artificially propped up in many ways. Sure. Is this the way in which a free market should operate?
Absolutely not. That's a rhetorical question. Of course that's not the way free markets should operate.
Governments sold electricity companies, gas companies, our utilities to private enterprise. Could it be argued that really now government didn't have a role to do that because ultimately the markets, the energy markets here, are now failing? Is that a prime example of where either you allow the market to work or the government actually runs it themselves for the social good?
Well, the social good ultimately, as we know, there's plenty of lessons around the world, whether you want to go to Caracas or to Hanoi or wherever you want to go. We know the ultimate result of these things. But clearly, what we have seen as a result of government policy in energy is that there's been no investment in coal-fired plants. And so they're being retired or they're breaking down, and inevitably what we're going to be left with is unreliable and erratic renewable energy, which will not do the job when we need the base load power. We're not allowed to go into nuclear. So what we're going to find come the winter is that either we're looking to spend another $3 billion, I think it is, to try and keep the household intact when it comes to higher energy prices, but that's just fiddling with it. It's not actually doing what the market would want to do. And unlike what we're seeing in Europe, where at least they preserved or kept their coal-fired power stations, we blow ours up. So we don't even have them to turn to in the event that we don't have enough gas and we don't have enough coal-fired power. We don't have enough baseload energy.